respiratory organs of domestic animals. Gross anatomy of the lungs. Gross anatomy of the lungs. Lungs, general description: lungs of the donkeys, lungs of the buffalo, lungs of the goats, lungs of the camels, lungs of the dogs. Lungs, general description: the lungs are a pair of light brown to light rose-colored, semi-cone-shaped organs with a soft, spongy texture located within the chest cavity. Each lung has 3 surfaces: medial, costal, and diaphragmatic, 3 borders: dorsal, ventral, and basal, an apex, and a base. The costal surface and the dorsal border of each lung present well-demarcated costal impressions. Lungs, general description: the right lung is divided into 3 lobes: the cranial, apical, the accessory, and the caudal, diaphragmatic. The left lung comprises 2 lobes: the cranial, apical, and the caudal, diaphragmatic. The fissure between cranial and caudal lobes presents the cardiac notch. Lungs, general description: the cranial lobe represents the apex and is situated anteriorly at the thoracic inlet. The base is concave and rests on the dome of the diaphragm. The dorsal border is thick and rounded and lies against the thoracic vertebrae at the dorsal line of reflation between costal and mediastinal surfaces. The basal border is thin, sharp, and irregular, and encircle the base of the lung at the line of reflection between the costal and diaphragmatic surfaces. The ventral border encircle the cardiac notch at the ventral line of reflation between costal and mediastinal surfaces. Surfaces of lung. The costal surface is largest surface, relates to ribs, and has costal impressions. The diaphragmatic surface, base of lung, is concave and relates to diaphragm. Medial surface divides to vertebral and mediastinal parts. Vertebral part relates to bodies of thoracic vertebrae and has aortic, esophageal, azygos vein impressions and groove for caudal vena cava in right lung only, while mediastinal part relates to heart and mediastinum and has cardiac impression, which is deeper in left lung. Pulmonary hilus and root. The pulmonary hilus locates in the mediastinal surface and has pulmonary root. The pulmonary root is represented by the structures entering principal bronchus, pulmonary artery, bronchial artery, and pulmonary nerve plexus, and leaving pulmonary veins, bronchial veins, tracheobronchial lymph nodes, and pulmonary lymphatics. The lung area of adhesion of 2 lungs locates caudal to hilus, not covered by pleura and bounded dorsally and ventrally by lines of reflection of the pulmonary ligament. Self-study. In the corresponding photo, dorsolateral view of donkey's lungs, identify the labeled items. Lungs of donkey. The left lung divides into 2 lobes, cranial and caudal lobes. The right lung divides into 3 lobes, cranial, caudal, and accessory lobes. The middle lobe is absent. The cranial lobes of both lungs are undivided externally. The interlobar fissures are not clear. The cranial and caudal lobes are separated by cardiac notch. The interlobular septa, which divided the pulmonary lobes into smaller lobules, are missing. Lungs of the buffalo. The left lung divides into 2 lobes, cranial lobe, which divided to cranial and caudal parts, and caudal lobe. The right lung divides into 4 lobes, cranial lobe, which divided to cranial and caudal parts, middle, accessory, and caudal lobes. The interlobar fissures are clear. The interlobular septa were well defined and divided the lung's lobes into distinct lobules. Lungs of the goat. The left lung divides into 2 lobes, cranial lobe, which divided to cranial and caudal parts, and caudal lobe. The right lung divides into 4 lobes, cranial lobe, which divided to cranial and caudal parts, middle, accessory, and caudal lobes. The interlobar fissures are clear. The interlobular septa are restricted, not cover the whole lungs, and are less demarcated. Lungs of camel. The left lung divides into two lobes, cranial and caudal lobes. The right lung divides into three lobes, cranial, caudal, and accessory lobes. The middle lobe is absent. The cranial lobes of both lungs are undivided externally. The interlobar fissures are unclear. The interlobular connective septa tissues are clear. Along the basal margins of the lungs, the visceral pleura covering the lungs extends beyond the ventral border, forming a lace-like fringes. Lungs of dog. The left lung divides into two lobes, cranial lobe, which divided to cranial and caudal parts, and caudal lobe. The right lung divides into four lobes, undivided cranial, accessory, middle, and caudal lobes. The interlobar fissures are very deep. The interlobular fissures are absent. A summary of the main comparative points of the lungs of the animals investigated: donkey, buffalo, camel, goat, and dog. Self-study. In the corresponding photo, donkey's lungs, identify the labeled items. Self-study. In the corresponding photo, buffalo's lungs, identify the labeled items.